So I just wanted to, sort of say everybody, Christianity had its say, Hinduism has had its say. And here we are in modernity. What is making sense to me as a thinker? Let me start with that. That has been my approach to the ancients. That the ancients were buried over by some form of thinking which is no longer valid.
I think should we have a few questions now? Ed, do you have any more? Should we do a Q&A?
Beyond the hour, so I think we should move to Q&A and then take maybe a 5-10 minute break and then come back for the second session.
Sure. So there are several questions here. So I'd like to ask one. So this is from Dr. Prakash Shah. So he's asking, if the Christian and Indian paths are so different, how can panelists justify use of terms like salvation, worship, etc., which seem to confuse and tend to fuse Indian traditions to a version of Christianity?
My answer simply is that the confusion has already happened and we cannot avoid it. My approach would be to take those terms up and say, okay, salvation means this in Hinduism. Now, what the hell does it mean in Christianity? What does it mean in Christianity? I mean, we all say that the terms are equal and stuff. Does it mean that I go to heaven and I sit on green grass and pluck a harp? What does it mean? I'm a scholar and I'm well studied. And if any one of you knows any Christian publication that describes heaven to me, please email it to me. I will read it. So it's not this way that these terms are either Christian or Hindu. These terms have arisen out of a historical confrontation between several modes of thinking, and many modes of thinking about things such as salvation have been run over. In fact, the word salvation does not even belong to Christianity. Historically speaking, it belongs to the Greeks. The Greeks had the notion of salvation first. Even Homer had it in terms of returning a homecoming, safe homecoming to the source. So that's my answer. My answer is simply that we have to take these terms and learn to think about what they mean. The confusion is already here, right?
Yeah, and I'd just like to emphasize what Vishwa was just saying, in the sense that the dialogue is already happening, and it's been happening all this time, and often in an extremely dysfunctional way. And so when we're using these Western terms, the point isn't to impose them upon another tradition. The point is that this dialogue is already happening in a very dysfunctional way between Western, implicitly Christian and monotheist thought, and all of its many others, its many global others. We're trying to intervene in that dialogue, which has already been going on, and make explicit some of the ways in which it's been dysfunctional, and to reorient it and to recast it in a way that it can be a more helpful vehicle, a more useful vehicle, where genuine dialogue that goes both ways can take place. And so that's the significance of using these terms. You know, within traditions, obviously, a person uses the terms which are really accurate to that tradition. When we're using these Western terms, which become terms of art in a discourse about religions, then that's a different conversation. And what we're trying to do is rectify the dysfunction in that conversation.
Srinivas?
Yes.
Okay. I know you're the moderator and are selecting questions, but there's one that Arundhati ji has been asking a few times in the chat window. And it goes kind of to the heart.
Sure.
It's a great question because it goes to the heart of what drew Vishwa from his Parmenides work into Indian thought. So,
okay. Would you like to read it?
Or would you ask it?
Can you go ahead and read it?
Yeah, I'll read it out. So she's asking for an explanation of singularity for a Hindu who doesn't understand, and he's saying what is the Sanskrit word that would correspond to singularity. Vish, unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Well, this is what I began my talk with, that for us, it is not, look, the universe is arranged according to categories, okay? Simply speaking, let's say plants, animals, plants have their own classifications, monocotyledons, dicotyledons, and animals have their own thing like unicellular, multicellular, and then, until we come to vertebrae, and the vertebrata has 5 classes, fishes, birds, and so on. So that's what I mean by each of these is a universal. Each of these is a universal. It is a definition which subsumes under it all the members that belong to that definition. All identities are universal. So if I say I am Indian, there are so many Indians. If I say I'm male or female or whatever my age group, these are all universals. But the jiva is a singular. There is something in me which only my death can identify. So even if I was not here, Joy could have very easily talked to you all about my philosophy. So in a way, this is what singularity means, that each one is an irreplaceable, unique individual that may be born, and that singularity is so well preserved in Hinduism. One may be born as a Brahmana, one can be born as a Kshatriya, one can even be born as a fish or as a snake or as a bird. In Plato, the singularity of Agamemnon, the great hero of the Trojan War, the emperor and the commander-in-chief, chooses the life of an eagle. So when I look at people and say they are just Hindus, or they are just Muslims, or this is right-wing, or this is left-wing, what we're doing is just classifying them into boxes. And we are not paying attention to that singular. Only 2 places where the singular makes an appearance. One is in death. When we lose someone we love, they're not replaceable. And we understand something. Oh, there's something here. And we never say when our beloved dies, koi mar gaya, sab marte hain. And the other is in love. So if I love someone and they die and they have a twin, I'm not going to say, same DNA, right? So there is something absolutely filled with value, Brahman, in that singularity. And this is why I dislike even these DNA experiments on Aryan migrations and so on. Who knows in your next life where you're migrating, where you're going to be migrating to? Your DNA is not going to tell you that. So do not reduce people to appearances. Do not reduce people to identities. Always respect them as that singular. That's what I mean that's what I mean by singularity. The other one is particulars. So universals have particulars. So when I say apple, one apple is as good as another to me. I just eat one and I'll see, I ate one yesterday, I bought 6, I have 5 left. That's what I mean.
Srinivas, do you have more?
But I think,
Or should we
Yes,
begin?
Arundhati ji was also asking what is the equivalent term in the Indian tradition, equivalent to singular?
The place where I felt it, I can't say that it is in the Bhagavad Gita chapter 12, no, chapter 15, where Krishna says, Mama Vamsho Jiva Loke. So that Amsha, Mama Amsha, that there I found, because that the Amsha is not fully, it's an Amsha, and there's a distinction from Brahman, but there's also the full support of Brahman. So that's the most Advaitic way to talk about singularity, that when Krishna says the jiva, the transmigrating soul, is a ray or an emanation or a particle of me that has embodied and is taking birth after birth.
Okay, thank you, Vishwa. Joy, I think I have several more questions, but I think I could ask them in the coming sessions.
Okay.
I think the subject matter of the questions actually does agree with the sessions which are upcoming.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel it's a good time to now start the second session,
Okay.
which is the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. I think that is your session with Vishwa.
I would like
so would
1
you like
minute. I would like to get one coffee. So 1 minute.
So let's
Okay.
pause for 5 minutes, and we come back in 5 minutes.
Okay, fine. Let's take a 3 to 5 minute
Anyone
break.
who does not need the 5 minute break can obviously continue chatting within the window, and we'll come back and look at it. Otherwise, we'll pause for 5 and come back. Thank you.
And I don't know if you had something to eat. Would you like to grab something as well? It's very early in the morning for you guys.
I'll take a brief break and be back with you for the second session.
Okay, sure. Yeah, see you soon.
Yeah. Can I say a few words?
Sorry, sir?
Yeah. Udumudi?
He's attending a call, sir, I think.
Okay. Just check with him. I just want to have it. Srinivas, I just wanted to say a few words.
Yeah.
So I want to take your permission before I.
No, actually, I was going to ask you to, in fact, speak immediately after one of the breaks. I thought the break would happen maybe after the second session, but I guess it's just happened now. So yeah, this would be a good time.
Okay. No, I just wanted to thank everybody and want to mention that this is the second in the series. We talked about this earlier, but I want to talk about it a bit more. We've started this concept of legacy partnerships. And so we are engaging with a few scholars on a more intimate basis and discussing with them about their legacy. What is it that they would like their legacy to be when they are 80 years old and they look back at their life. So this whole series is about that. The first one was with Balu Gangadhara. This one is with Vishwa. One of the things, next legacy session is with Michel Danino on the 21st of June. Again, Srinivas is curating this, and we're going to have a few of Michel's colleagues also participate. And we're going to look at his work on Saraswati. We're looking at his work, the IIT Kharagpur videos and the body of work that he has done. We're also looking at the CBSE and the IKS platform that he's building. Michel is one of the, he brought this IKS into framework in terms of the various fields. So, his seminal work with CBSE and as well as what he's doing at IIT Gandhinagar. So we'll be having 4 sessions.
As well as his engagement with Sri Aurobindo, the book he has written on Indian culture.
Yes. So that's his personal journey. We're going to deal with that. So that's going to be a very interesting session on the 21st of June, Sunday. So do mark your diaries. He's based in India, so it would be during the daytime. It won't be so late in the afternoon. Apart from that, the next one in July would be with Meenakshi Jain. So you know the kind of work that she has been doing, so we will be covering her. So this is the basic idea of these retrospective, prospective work. One of the things I appeal to all of you is to look at being mentored by these eminent scholars. All the research scholars who are listening in, I would appeal to you that it's important that these legacies of these venerable scholars be continued, and we would be very happy to facilitate this interaction between the scholars. And these webinars are for this purpose, that you understand their body of work, and if this resonates with you, then you reach out to us, and then we will facilitate a fellowship, internship, whatever work that they are doing. And if you are keen on doing, please do reach out to us. And that's a very, very fervent appeal. We can do all these things, and we want to do a lot of things, but ultimately scholarship can only thrive when people reach out and respond to our various initiatives. Srinivas, thank you.
Thank you, Harikinji. I think we have maybe a minute or two. Well, okay, the panelists are back.
I'm back.
Okay, so
someone was supposed to join us, right? Krishnan also?
He's going to join in 40 minutes, so I'll do my presentation and then he'll be here by then.
Okay.
Okay. So, Joy, are you ready to get started?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
So, let me begin here. Go into my window and then I'm set for sharing. So thank you everyone for the first session. Appreciate your being here, appreciate Indic Academy for organizing this, for all their technical effort and their manpower. And of course, Srinivas, who's been the curator of this selection of ideas, thoughts, and books. Now, I already started with a little biographical recollection of Vishwa, but this session is now going to take us from the early biographical stuff into the Indological stuff, which I'm sure many of you are more familiar with, or which you've been following over the last few years. So let me start with a kind of brief statement of what this session will do, and I will also include the next 4 sessions here. Let me first go to my share and start the share so we have something before us. Okay, perfect. Are we seeing this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is the second session, the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. The quarrel is a very famous episode that happened at the Académie Française in the 17th century, when there was this huge debate over whether the ancients were still normative for thought, for literature, for art, or whether moderns had exceeded them in knowledge. And this battle raged at the Academy, and very famous people like Fontenelle took sides in it. And the upshot of this debate was to say that in the humanities and in literature and the arts, the ancients remain normative, but as concerns technology, the sciences, we have vastly exceeded them. That was sort of the split that was done. It doesn't remain there. In fact, when the modern humanities take off, there is a renewed attempt to show that modern critical thought, philology, is superior to what the ancients had. So there is a kind of ongoing project of mastery of the ancients. And this is what we're going to look at, the mastery of ancient Indian thought by a modernity that claims that the concepts, the values, the norms of ancient thought are no longer valid, and that the scholar, the 20th century or the 19th century scholar, is now the mediating figure between antiquity and the reader. The reader cannot directly access antiquity. There is no tradition of transmission, but now has to go through a central mediating figure who is the expert on the past and therefore the spokesperson or the teacher for the future or the present. And this is a huge problem. It's a problem in relation to the humanities generally, but certainly in regards to Indian tradition, where the notion that the tradition has been broken or interrupted, that there's no direct access to these texts, becomes hugely problematic, because Hinduism is living proof that the tradition was not broken. and that there is a tradition of learning and transmission that continues outside of the university. The expert is not called upon to give his judgment. So that's this presentation. Now let me, before I actually get into it, go into the 4 parts that were planned for today. So ancient Greek beginnings, this is what you just heard. Ed introduced and reflected on the beginning of Vishwa's intellectual journey. And Ed will also come back in the next one when he will introduce and read out a section of his book, Polytheism and Indology. Now mine is number 2. I will speak about German Indology. I will introduce you to the nescience. What is the problem with the reception of Indian texts in the West? How did this problem arise? And here I'll be discussing Vishwa's insight that a Christian theological project is at the bottom of so-called scientific research into Indian texts. So this research, although it calls itself scientific, wissenschaftlich, is by no means scientific. It is nothing a scientist would recognize. It does not meet basic tests of objectivity. It is, in fact, a theological project that has been disguised as critical scientific research. And I will also then speak about a little bit about the counter to the Western interpretation of the Mahabharata. The third part, the humanities in crisis, is obviously going to address the present day crisis of humanities. I have a presentation there, but Ed is also going to read a section from his book there. And the final one, Vishwa and I will converse with Gautam. And this is going to be on the Mahabharata, and this is going to be extremely conversational, extremely lucid and accessible. So really the big presentation is the one right now. And I'm caffeinated here. So I hope all of you are also caffeinated, and let's get into it. I begin not by quoting the nescience, but by quoting Ed Butler's book, Polytheism and Indology. This is actually from the foreword, and it's a brilliant and lucid statement. I think Ed has sort of gathered, as no one has, what the nescience means. I'm not saying the nescience because it's a book Vish and I wrote. Anyone who knows academic publishing knows that academic books are not going to ever make you rich. With all that it has sold, it has gotten us $25 or something in royalty. The point here is that the nescience is an important landmark event, as Ed has seen. Its humble title notwithstanding, Adluri and Bakchi's book is no mere history, but is itself a historic moment in the Indian intellectual tradition's self-assertion in the global arena as no longer merely an object of study, but a producer of knowledge for itself and for the world. India has been producing knowledge for thousands of years, of course. But entry into the contemporary globalized setting of knowledge has demanded a reckoning with powers that have sought to determine exclusively the terms upon which India might enter. This reckoning required investigating the ideological setting of Indology, the ostensibly scientific enterprise in which India found itself embroiled. So the terms of debate or the terms of engagement could not be clearer. India has been for nearly 200 years an object of study. It has not been a producer of knowledge. It has not set the world picture of modernity. It has received that picture, and to use the analogy or the metaphor of Cinderella's slipper again, India has tried to force its way into that slipper and to, conform to expectations of it, which are coming from outside, which are not germane or not natural to its own being. And the nescience marks that moment when we no longer try and explain our traditions back, but we start to ask Western traditions questions about their origins, their authenticity, and their authority. So with that said, let me begin with a rather dramatic slide. Yes, I'm right. So it is a dramatic slide. This is Jakob Wilhelm Hauer, and he's lecturing on Indian thought. And he made himself this expert on yoga. Don't ask me where he gets his expertise from, because it's a very bizarre, strange yoga that conforms to National Socialist ideals and shaping of the new man and has elements of Aryanism in it. The problem would not be if Jakob Wilhelm Hauer was an isolated individual, right? We can account for cranks And that does not reveal something problematic about the system of Indology. But when the crank is a product of that system, when that crank is not recognized as a crank, but as a legitimate authority, as a spokesperson, there is a problem. And this is what we actually see. Hauer is not an outsider to Indology. He established the Aryan Seminar in Tübingen. He became one of the most popular speakers. He was a student of the well-known Tübingen Indologist Richard von Garber, and his ideas were in continue with his teachers. So this is not something new he's doing. He's playing a game of identifying the original Gītā, which all of them had been doing. And philological studies of Indian texts were now to show a certain formation of Indian thought, that Indian thought was ideologically corrupted, that it was Brahmanic, that there was a purer sense of theism or of monotheism at the beginning of Indian thought, and then it had been successively corrupted. And critical philology would recover this original moment in Indian thought. The Nay Science, as I mentioned, is a book. I think most of you know of it. Those of you who don't, this is the cover and these are the themes. I won't read out the themes. I just want to notice 2 or 3 points here. First, the encounter with Indian thought does not happen in a vacuum. It happens out of the legacy of Protestant Christianity's own conquest of its Catholic predecessor and its polemics against Judaism. This is the intellectual historical situation in which Indian texts begin to appear in Western Europe. It's around the same time. Second, the argument used is that of scientific research, because the humanities, the social sciences are modeling themselves on the natural sciences. And so they're trying to say we are objective like the natural sciences. We give you factual knowledge. So they abandon their work of interpretation, understanding, development of the person, maturing of a person, ethics, and they try and pretend that they are like the natural sciences. And finally, this whole project is institutionalized within the German university with massive amounts of funding and support. A friend of ours, a scholar, calls it the Sanskrit Reich, and I'll show you a slide of his work later on. But so much about the book and its project. So the presentation is divided into 3 parts: background, formation, race, and philology. I will not spend the same amount of time on any of them because obviously, we have limited time and our interests are also going to vary. So sometimes I may move on beyond a few slides. Let me just pause the share here and come back because I know it's very tiring when someone is click, click, click going through slides and you like to see a face and a person addressing you. So I will keep coming back periodically. I may look at the window, but I may not take your questions, but do keep engaging in the window because we can come back to it at the end. And if there's an important question that I see and I feel should be answered or someone wants to unmute and ask, please do that. All right, so that said, let's go into the first section. There is a huge change even within Christianity that takes place with the Reformation. And the Reformation lays the groundwork for Protestantism. Protestantism breeds the modern research university in Germany in the 19th century. It is a Protestant institution. And that institution sets up the terms of engagement with ancient cultures through the notions of the new Textwissenschaft and the textual sciences, paramount among them being philology. But what is this change as concerns us? There is a distinction that Luther makes, Luther being the founding figure of the German Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and he makes a distinction between a theology of glory, Theologia gloriae, and a Theologia crucis, which is the theology of the cross, crucis here meaning cross. There is a distinction in the Theologia crucis from the Theologia gloriae in the sense that the first is a theology of glory. Ancient philosophers, according to Luther, tried to ascend using their reason. They tried to conceptualize God. They were systematically building up philosophical concepts and attempting an ascent to God. And according to Luther, the hubris, the arrogance of the ancients is marked in Christianity and in Christianity alone. When God comes down, not in his splendor, but as his son, as a poor, suffering, crucified individual. And this is showing the ridiculousness of the philosopher's attempt to theologically or conceptually grasp God. And Luther actually has a comment on Paul. It's 1 Corinthians, I think 2:7, if I remember, where he actually comments on that and says, who in the world would have thought this? All the philosophers in their wisdom, they could not have ever expected that God would come down as the crucified Son of God, rather than as what they had been imagining. This sets up a huge problem in that philosophy itself now appears hubristic and is what has to be conquered through philology or shown to be false through philology. That break, I already mentioned the quarrel between the ancients and moderns. That is one episode in the quarrel, but in fact, since the Renaissance, there have been a series of quarrels where modernity is constantly negating its immediate past to define itself as modern. And if you have read the social research interview by Vishwa, you will see how in the Marburg experience, they could only constitute themselves as secular, modern, critical, rational through an antithesis. By positing the Indian, here it was Vishwa, but it is all Indian students in Germany suffer this fate. They have to play the role of a racialized role of being religious, superstitious, trapped in the past. And therefore, there is a kind of problematic interaction, a racialized interaction that is set up where the professor constitutes himself as modern and critical through negating what immediately came before or through negating the Indian past. This is sort of, if the word Theologia crucis was difficult to grasp, this is sort of what it looks like. This is God twisted on the cross, not a figure of glory. In fact, here he's portrayed in a position of great agony, tortured, sick. This is actually in the Isenheim, this is the Isenheim altarpiece. This is Matthias Grunewald. And God has actually taken on the illness and the sufferings of the people who suffered from a disease called ergotism. And John the Baptist is actually pointing at this visible initiation of God and saying, that is God. You know that this is actually anachronistic because John the Baptist was not alive at this time, but he was the first to recognize that Christ is God. And therefore, he's been introduced into the picture. Okay. Even contemporaries recognized what Luther was doing. Here you have a woodcut from Hans Holbein, and he is showing you Luther killing off antiquity. Let me see if it is possible to use a pointer, laser pointer. Here you see Aristotle, all the philosophers. This is the Catholic Inquisitor, Jakob von Hoekstra. Occam is here, St. Thomas is here. The philosophers of antiquity, as well as the fathers of the church, have been clubbed to death by Luther's Hercules Germanicus. So the conquest of philosophy, the beating down of the tradition that is accomplished by Luther is the background within which Indology begins its engagement with Indian thought. Let me go back out of the pointer option and go to the next slide. An alternative way here is represented, and this is also by Hans Holbein, and he is showing you Erasmus of Rotterdam with his hands carefully in a gesture of love, in a gesture of tenderness on a book. And in the background, you see more books. So you see there is a different attitude towards learning embodied in this figure. This is the great humanist, Erasmus of Rotterdam, and a different attitude. His gaze is calm and serene. And look at the title of the book here. Do you see the red pointer? The title is The Labors of Hercules. The book he is holding is titled Labors of Hercules. So he's actually making a reference to the previous slide and contrasting two different approaches to antiquity. This is as much as I will say. There are many more slides in this section, but time is limited, and I promised I would not keep clicking through slides one by one. I would come back and talk to you. This is as much as we need to know about the setting of German Indology, that there is this conquest of the past, there is this antithetical attitude towards philosophy, towards theology, insofar as it is not the Christian theology of the cross, but a hubristic pagan theology of glory. And that will be the term, those are the terms of engagement that get set up for engaging with Indian thought. Are there questions up till here? Is anyone sort of wondering? Okay, good. So no questions. Then I will now move to the second thing. There is, however, before I move on, something very, very important to mention. This is the general encounter with Indian thought, but something very specific also happens, which is a continuous critique of Brahmanism. The Brahmins are the evildoers. The Brahmins are the problem with Indian society. The Brahmins have corrupted Hinduism or the Vedic revelation or the original religion called Brahmanism, and they have made it into Hinduism. I will later show you some horrific, problematic quotes by German Indologists complaining about modern day Hinduism. But before we get to that, what is the intellectual context? The Brahmins are seen as priests. Hinduism is seen as a priestly religion. It asks for rituals, and this is a criticism that Protestants have of Catholicism, that it has become ceremonialistic. There's all this emphasis on receiving the communion, all the rituals, all the liturgical performance. It's not needed. The elaborate ornamented churches, they're not needed. There is also criticism of legalism, that sin is now a trade-off, that you have an entire sort of catalog of sins, and the importance of grace, remission of sin through grace, has been lost because there is now a calculus that you have ablas. I forget the English word for ablas. Vishwa, can you help me? Ablas handle, that the Pope will take money and in return give you salvation. Indulgences, that's it, ablas. So the sale of indulgences becomes a problem. This context is anti-Catholic, but it is specifically in Luther also anti-Judaic. And I'll show you two slides that show you both the anti-Catholic and the anti-Judaic aspects of it. I need to go back to share. So this is the anti-Judaism that comes to the fore with Luther. He did not, this is a woodcut, and the woodcut is representing a sow, and some Jews are suckling from the teats of the sow, and a rabbi is looking up the arse of the sow. This is actually a carving. This is something known as the Judensau, the Jewish pig, or the Jewish, I don't know what a female pig is. Sow, it's sow in English as well. This is a carving on many churches, and it predates the Protestant Reformation. This is not specifically Protestant, but Luther gives it a particular interpretation. And to my knowledge, there is no place where the relationship between what the rabbi is making, what the rabbi is looking at up the arse of the sow, and the Hebrew Bible is being made. Luther is the first person who connects these two. What does he say? Here in Wittenberg, on our parish church, there is a sow carved in stone. Under her, young piglets and Jews lie sucking. Behind the sow stands a rabbi who lifts the sow's right leg, and with his left hand, he pulls her rear over himself. He bends down and looks more studiously under her rear at the Talmud inside. No carving could show you the Talmud was inside. This is Luther's interpretation, his addition. As if he wanted to read and see something difficult and special. This is most likely where they got their Shem Hamphorus. So Shem Hamphorus is the Jewish name of the ineffable God, represented by the 4 letters, the Tetragrammaton. This kind of sets up the attitude towards ancient texts, that whatever they say is made up, it's not true, it doesn't need to be taken seriously, and it's somehow, not true divinity. It's a corruption made up by the rabbis. This is the first slide I said I would show you regarding the anti-Judaism. The second will be regarding the anti-Catholicism. So these are again woodcuts. Luther was a great propagandist. On the first one, the Pope is riding on a sow. He's dragging the sow. Let me turn to a pointer. He's getting the sow to move forwards because he's holding a pile of shit in his hands and blowing on the shit. So the smell of it is attracting the sow forwards. This is Luther's view of the church. And here again, the Pope is seated and he's fanning away. Some people have come up and are impudently farting in his face, and he's fanning that away with the Bible. A Lutheran hatred of Roman Catholic priesthood underlies anti-traditional critical reading. These attitudes are deeply ingrained, and you will see some quotes in the next presentation from scholars from today that reflect this notion that somehow the modern critic is A, superior. He knows the text. 2, he is in full control of his discourse. He is in control of his speech. Whereas the Pope here is obviously, when he says do X, Y, Z, he's only saying it for the money or for the power or the prestige he's getting. So the Pope is not in control of his discourse. The traditional scholar is not an authority figure, or as an authority figure, he must be questioned. And the third point that will be quite dominant in modern readings is that we have to engage in a critical reading that deconstructs the text and shows that, for example, the Shem Hamphoras is nothing by itself. It does not exist. It is something that has been made up by a group of humans, and we have to expose this as the lie of Judaism, the lie of Hinduism, etc., etc. All right, let me come back to a regular pointer and go to the formation. This is now the specifically Indological part of it, and I will cover this section, and the third one I will probably, for reasons of time, I will maybe do 1 or 2 slides. This is kind of important. I'm going to go to the philosopher Hegel. The quote is not important except to understand that Hegel is a Protestant. He reaffirms his Protestantism several times. He says, I am a Lutheran. My philosophy proves that Lutheranism is true. I've been confirmed in my Lutheranism by my philosophy. So the project of German idealism with Hegel is very much a religious project, except translated into these terms of a speculative philosophy. I already mentioned this. The first point on the slide, I'm a Lutheran, etc. The more important point for us to understand is that the link between Lutheranism, the Protestant state, the Prussian state, and the university is established in a tie with the creation of the modern research university. This happens in 1810 with the founding of the University of Berlin. This model is hugely successful. It spreads like wildfire across Germany. It then spreads to the United States. Johns Hopkins is the first university established as on the model of the German Research University, but Cornell already, with Andrew Dickinson White, has someone who is very much influenced by the German system, and he reestablishes Cornell on the German research model. Indian universities also set up their program of teaching in terms of this research specialization. They do import German scholars. They import German Sanskritists to come to India. The most famous example is Bühler comes to India, and in Pune, Deccan College, Franz Kielhorn is appointed by the British government. The interesting thing here is that while Kielhorn is this professor setting up this research paradigm, guess who is teaching him Sanskrit? Who is he learning Sanskrit from? Anyone, unmute yourselves, put it in the window if you want. I'm going to come out and actually see you. Okay, so I'm here. Do you all see me? Okay, so why?
Yes, we see you. And this is an important question. Thank you for bringing it up. It just shows the diversity in power playing a role in shaping what the contemporary Indian academic program is. I know about Macaulay and all that, but on a more insidious level, what Joy is bringing up is important.
So I saw Jay Gina answered Brahmins, and that is correct. In fact, his teachers were Shastris in Pune. they were earning a fraction of what he was earning. He was their employer, their professor. They were simply hired as Shastris, but they were teaching him Sanskrit and earning much less. So you see this institutional imbalance has set up Indians as informants, suppliers of information, the true experts in terms of knowledge of the tradition and of the language, but they are supplying that now in return for financial support. The Western scholar is not providing the Sanskrit. He is providing the ideology that places Sanskrit within a world historical framing. He is providing the ideology that tells you how to approach Sanskrit texts while he's gaining all the tradition from. And in my next presentation, I'll show you some contemporary scholars who have continued with that paradigm. But I just wanted to stop here and establish this, that the research university has been a Protestant project. And the notion of research itself, that there's something to be done to these traditions, they have to be dissected, taken apart, placed along a historical timeline, itself harbors this ideological notion. So let me pause there, go back to the share and do a few more slides. We will focus here not on the Mahabharata, which will be the fourth session, but a section of the Mahabharata that all of you know well, the best known section, the Bhagavad Gītā. And we will look at how the arrival of the Bhagavad Gītā in Germany causes huge intellectual problems for Hegel's project. And the interest that people have for Indian thought actually threatens Hegel's Lutheran philosophical project. And so that has to be mastered through this discipline of Indology. Share screen. And go to full view mode. We're here. So Indian studies get their beginning in Germany with Friedrich Schlegel. He writes a book called Die Sprache und Weisheit der Indier, the language and wisdom of the Indians in 1808. This is the very year that he converts to Catholicism. So Schlegel is Protestant, he becomes a neo-Catholic. The end of this text has an appendix which has excerpts from the Bhagavad Gītā that he has translated. But the important impact of the book is not in terms of the translation, but in terms of the argument he makes about Indian thought. The claim he makes is that India has undergone a decline, a corruption, because of an excessive rationalism. So it has ended up in pantheism. The Bhagavad Gītā is a pantheistic text, but this is a feature of excessive rationalism. And so there's been a decline from the original revelation. The original revelation is pure. It was given to Indians. And then there was a decline into pantheism due to their rationalism. If you look at this structure, it is a critique of Catholicism, of Protestantism from the perspective of Catholicism, because there is an original revelation. Too much rationalism is leading to a decline, and we end up in Protestantism. So the reception of Indian texts from the beginning is made a foil for concerns at home in Germany. All of Schlegel's contemporaries understood him to be saying this. There was no secret about the project. There was no secret about what he was saying. And so Indology begins as this science to, engage with Indian thought on these terms and reverse the understanding. I'm just getting a sip of water before I continue. This reading of Indian thought gives rise to something called the Pantheism Controversy, which begins in 1785. And the famous philosopher Jacobi reveals that Lessing, who is known as an Enlightenment figure, who is known as a critic, had confessed on his deathbed to being a Spinozist, that is, an adherent of the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza. This controversy rages, and different people such as Goethe and Kant take sides on this. Goethe and so on attack Schlegel, saying we can smell the incense from the church coming out of this book. We can sort of sense these black ravens flying around the church belfry. They understand this is a Catholic attack on Protestantism. I already mentioned this, so it coincides with this conversion to Catholicism. Contemporaries such as Goethe and Heine attack Schlegel. Ever since then, Indian studies in Germany stood under the suspicion of being seditious or subversive. As a result, Indology has to affirm its commitment to the Enlightenment, to the Prussian state, and to a kind of overwrought secularism. Practically, this took the form of trying to teach the Indians to read their own text critically. This is the intellectual historical background within which Indology emerges. And to pause here for a moment, come out because I don't want to go through every single slide with you, and just ask, up till now, has the connection between the Protestant Reformation, the framing of its criticism on Catholicism, the framing of its criticism of Judaism, it's turned towards antiquity in this kind of antithetical way, and then the project set up in the 19th century Germany in the university, is that much clear? If there are questions
Yes.
at this point?
No, that came out very clearly.
Okay, great. So if there, I see that sort of 21 questions rather. Srinivas, you'll be asking those at the end?
Yes. I'm making note of which questions to raise for this session, and I will ask.
Great. So let me go through 2 more slides in this section, and then actually 4 in total. I'll skip some of the longer quotes, so we are on time. After Schlegel, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who is the founder of the University of Berlin as the modern research university in 1810, he's also a statesman. He learned some Sanskrit. He is an extremely erudite, passionate person, very well read, has a great library at his Schloss in Tegel. He reads the Bhagavad Gītā, and he is extremely positive about it. He says the poem lives up more than any other work of this kind to the true and genuine concept of a philosophical poem. So that was the first point here. He also calls the Bhagavad Gītā the most profound and sublime work which the world has to offer. But the most dangerous assertion that he makes is that the Bhagavad Gīta's ethics of karma yoga and the Protestant work ethic are related. They're saying roughly the same thing. And he confesses that if anything could be said to have been the guiding principle of his life, it was the idea of karma yoga. This is a huge problem for Hegel.
Are you sharing something?
Am I sharing?
No.
Okay. Sorry. Let me come back out. I didn't start the share. Share screen. All right. Now you see this, right? So this is the slide I just explained. Wilhelm von Humboldt finds the Bhagavad Gītā to be a profound and sublime work, and he says its philosophy is similar to the Protestant work ethic and that he has tried to live by its philosophy. This kind of universalism, this kind of inclusivism, this kind of receptivity to the East becomes a problem. It is not what Hegel wants, because Hegel has a strong narrative history as progressing from the East to the West. So you start with China, move through India, move through Persia, move through ancient Greece, and spirit has its moment of self-realization, its ultimate culmination in Germany in the form of the Prussian state. So Humboldt's turn to India in an attitude of receptivity is problematic for this narrative that Hegel is forging of Western consciousness as the full realization of consciousness and ancient cultures as preliminary stages, lower down on the ladder. So Hegel now has to respond to this, which he does through a very long review of Humboldt's Gītā. The review is 2.5 times the length of the original article, and he sort of unleashes all the criticisms that he has of Indian thought against Humboldt here. Around 1827, Hegel's attitude towards Indian thought begins to change. This change is seen in his review of Humboldt's Gītā, but also the lectures on religion. It comes about at the exact time that Indian thought begins to threaten his philosophical system. I already mentioned the point, what the anxiety here is. Humboldt's enthusiastic reception of the Gītā appears to have been the tipping point. And Hegel now comes out strongly against Indian thought using all the standard accusations of quiescence, passivity, pantheism, ahistoricism, and spiritlessness. So I brought up this whole background because these are well-known criticisms of Indian thought. These are the terms in which Indian thought has tried to respond to the West. And it's a futile exercise because you cannot respond to that kind of question-begging accusation without further implicating yourself. An example of question-begging would be to ask someone, have you stopped beating your wife? Right? If you say, yes, I have, then you've answered the complex question, had a presupposition that you are beating or you at some point were beating your wife. You've affirmed that complex question. So now it's, oh, so you did beat your wife. And if you answer by saying no, then the answer will be, so, oh, you still are beating your wife. This is the standard example given in logic of a complex question. And there is no way to get out of this. There is no way to answer Hegel's charges except to go back, read Hegel and say, Mr. Hegel, one, you are not reading Indian thought. You do not have the sources needed to make these judgments. Two, you're not interested in Indian thought. You're not writing this for Indians. You're writing it in response to Humboldt. Three, you have stated you're a Lutheran. Your philosophical project is Lutheranism. Humboldt is threatening that project. That's why you're responding to him. This is roughly the work that was done in the Nayscience. Let me pause here, stop share, come back. The Nayscience was an attempt not to answer Western intellectual criticisms of Hinduism, of Indian thought, on the terms that had been laid out, but to go back and look at the intellectual history that caused these questions to appear, that posed the problem in a certain way. And by revealing that history, by writing a history of the Western reception, to end that reception and say that reception was not concerned with India at all. It was a debate internal to Germany, but it has had deleterious consequences, negative consequences for the self-understanding of Indian thought. So this section has 2 more slides, and then the next section I'll go through fairly rapidly.
Yes, Joy, I think we need to finish the next section in 5 minutes.
All right, so let me do
Max.
the next 2 slides and then maybe I'll skip to the conclusion. Hegel effectively closes the reception of the Bhagavad Gītā. Indian philosophy and literature cease to be taken seriously as offering contemporary models, contemporary values. They are now completely historicized. They can only be studied historically. And as I mentioned, a class of professional interpreters, the professors, now translate the overcome categories, the superseded categories of ancient thought and their modes of thinking of Indians into the terms of the present. This is the project that Indology has set itself up to do. It is the mastery of Indian intellectual traditions through historicism, through historicizing these texts. Let me do one last slide. This is what the reception of the Bhagavad Gītā prior to Hegel looked like. If I can go into a pointer view and show you a laser pointer. So there is a lively tradition of the reception of the Bhagavad Gītā. Humboldt reads it in 1826. Hegel writes his review, 1827. At that point, the reception of the Gītā is interrupted. It moves to the theosophists and sort of non-professional readers for a very long time, and it returns as academic Indology only in 1870. And this is the very problematic attempt to disband the Bhagavad Gītā, break it up into sections, take Krishna out and say Krishna is just a folk deity or just a cowherd. He is not a god. There's no real notion of God. The notion of Brahman is a Vedantic interpolation in the text. Hinduism added Vedantism, but it should not have been in the text. This becomes the project of dismantling the Bhagavad Gītā. Since we have a lot of questions, I'm going to stop the share here. This is as much for the quarrel of the ancients and moderns. And in the next section, then we'll pick up with the consequences of that quarrel for the present day crisis of the humanities. So if there are questions, Srinivas, go ahead.